Okay, thank you for having me. Gendered virtues, but without the gender, on empathy, shame, and attachment care. Virtues are often imagined to vary with the agent's sex, as when, for example, physical bravery is viewed as part of a male gender ideal, and empathic nurturance is viewed as part of a female gender ideal. In earlier work, such as Sexual Identities, a Cognitive Literary Study, I have joined a range of writers criticizing this differential mapping of virtue onto sex. In this essay, I wish to consider the degree to which such an aggregation of virtues into two classes is psychologically and/or ethically plausible, independent of the sexual identities or gender identifications of the agents. If this aggregation does make psychological and ethical sense, the question still arises as to how it comes to be gendered and what consequences this gendering has. To explore these issues, I take up not only affective and cognitive science, but literature and film as well. Specifically, I turn to Rabindranath Tagore's short story, Housewife, and Fatih Akin's film, Aus dem Nichts, as I believe these works provide insight into virtue and gender, particularly by connecting ethics with emotion systems, prominently empathy, shame, and attachment care. This talk was originally written as the valedictory address for a conference treating gender and literature at the Government College for Women in Srinagar, Kashmir. As you are no doubt aware, for more than 3 decades, Kashmir has been the site of military conflict over the political status of this region, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths caused by the occupying Indian forces and the revolutionaries. I have retained indications of this context as they remind us that these issues have significant practical consequences. First section is called Politics and Feeling. Begins with an epigraph from Laleshwari, the Kashmiri mystical poet. Shiva abides in all that is, everywhere. Then do not discriminate between a Hindu or a Muslim. At the end of my book on Kashmir, I present a list of 25 measures that might improve conditions for Kashmiri people, suffering as they are from a brutal military occupation and a brutal insurgency. Some of the measures that I urge are obvious, such as following international law. Others may be more surprising. This is the 9th recommendation. Vigorously pursue gender equality, first in terms of basic health and well-being. Jessica Stern points out that, quote, countries with a high ratio of males to females are significantly more prone to violence. The 2011 census of India, the most recent census when I was writing the book, shows that Jammu and Kashmir state has a ratio of 883 females to 1,000 males, a decline since the beginning of the insurgency, despite the number of young men killed over those decades. For comparison, India as a whole has 940 females for 1,000 males, and the United States has 1,025 females for 1,000 males. Clearly, the same gender equality policies should be pursued elsewhere in India as well. Such a disproportion is presumably due to a higher mortality rate for girls than boys. Ideally, such equality would address ideological issues as well. Often, the rage-provoking humiliation suffered by young men involves a sense of gender inadequacy. Wounded masculinity, as Jessica Stern refers to it. The best response to this is not making men feel more manly, but instead working to destigmatize so-called feminine traits so that a man's association with femininity is not humiliating, and the default response to humiliation of other sorts is not an assertion of hypermasculinity. I'm sure you all agree that equality of the sexes is a desirable goal in itself, but why is such equality also desirable in reducing civil conflict? There are presumably other contributory factors, but this correlation seems to derive in part from the different virtues associated with men and women, particularly the virtues that bear on violence. Before going on, I should explain that I am using the term gender in the sense of psychological traits and behavioral dispositions that are commonly associated with one sex. I do not believe that gender is predominantly or even largely innate. Indeed, I am very skeptical about most claims of gender differences, even when such differences are not claimed to be innate. Rather, I agree with writers such as Cordelia Fine, whose arguments and analyses suggest that the traits and dispositions we think of as feminine or masculine are to a great extent either misattributed, exaggerated, situational, or formed through processes of socialization. More precisely, I am highly skeptical that there is any necessary connection between sex, that is, being male or female, and gender, that is, being masculine or feminine. I also believe that any contingent connections are limited and alterable. Nonetheless, it does seem that the clustering of some virtues into two sets is, in some cases, not accidental. There seems to be, in other words, a natural tendency for some virtues to aggregate into the two groups that we commonly think of as masculine and feminine. In saying this, I'm referring specifically to those moral virtues that bear on violence, or more broadly, the infliction of harm on others. Following the narrative typology of moral virtues set out in Literature and Moral Feeling, we might refer to these two aggregates as heroic and familial ethical orientations. In that book, I argue that our moral values tend to be associated with preferred story structures or genres. One ideal of the heroic genre, for example, is bravely risking physical suffering or death for the sake of the in-group, typically through violent conflict. A roughly parallel ideal from the familial genre is undergoing emotional suffering for the sake of one's family, typically through nonviolent self-denial, for example, setting aside personal ambitions for the sake of some family member. In addition to story genres, we may understand ethical preferences as guided in part by the sorts of situation we ourselves face in daily life. Suppose we are asked about the main concerns of ethics. We may articulate certain types of principles. If we tacitly call to mind the processes governing hiring decisions or the distribution of salary increments, for example, if we've just come from a department meeting. But we may formulate very different principles if we implicitly apply our selection to raising children or nursing the terminally ill. The point about our daily lives fits well with Virginia Held's account of some possible differences between women's and men's views of ethics, though she does not phrase her argument in precisely these terms. The narrative genre and personal experience accounts of ethical preference are not mutually exclusive. Moreover, both seem compatible with our various ideas about ethics, including those that bear on responses to violence. It seems clear that heroic emplotment is traditionally linked with men more than women, while the reverse is true for familial emplotment. There are also life contexts that are similarly divided. But these points most obviously address particular ethical decisions as they are oriented by narrative structures or experimental contexts. They do not so clearly explain the division of virtues, which at least the story genres might be viewed as expressing rather than guiding. Consider, for example, research on empathy. Empathy is often conceived of as a specifically feminine virtue, and indeed, women appear to exhibit more empathy, even in controlled experimental settings. But there's a complication here. As it turns out, men are less likely than women to empathize and act on empathy spontaneously. However, when placed in circumstances where empathy is prized, and they are thereby motivated to empathize, men no longer show an empathy deficiency relative to women. This would seem to suggest that the gender difference in empathy is, at least to a great extent, the product of ideological and structural divisions, which assign, for example, the labor of child-rearing to women and the labor of fighting wars to men. Of course, in the case of child-rearing, there is a biological component to the division of labor, due to the need for women to suckle newborns. But this is a physical necessity that does not in itself entail any division of virtues. Similar points might hold with respect to other gendered virtues beyond empathy, physical bravery, for example, or an inclination to be confrontational or, in contrast, conciliatory. Thus, we are left with the question of why some actual virtues, such as empathy, follow a pattern of being capacities shared more or less equally across the sexes, but not expressed with the same spontaneous frequency. The last issue becomes even more vexing when we consider that the virtues at issue, distributed into their confrontational and conciliatory or antipathetic and empathetic aggregates, are not quite parallel. Many of us have the intuitive sense that there is a problem with the so-called masculine virtues. In common parlance, this intuition is signaled by the phrase toxic masculinity. As far as I'm aware, there is no such thing as toxic femininity. If there is, it is much rarer than toxic masculinity. I should note that I take this to be a product of socialization. It is not, say, a simple reflex of testosterone, as some people seem to assume, though testosterone may mildly facilitate the association of one moral aggregate with men and the other with women. As Sapolsky explains, quote, testosterone makes us more willing to do what it takes to attain and maintain status. Engineer social circumstances right, and boosting testosterone levels during a challenge would make people compete like crazy to do the most acts of random kindness. In our world, riddled with male violence, the problem isn't that testosterone can increase levels of aggression. The problem is the frequency with which we reward aggression. Rabindranath Tagore's first-person ethics. And there's another epigraph from Laleshwari, which I don't seem to have included here. When can I break the bonds of shame? Affective psychology, neurology, and other fields of empirical scientific study are crucial for understanding our ethical propensities, how we engage in ethical reasoning, when we act on such reasoning, and so on. Such objective studies might remind us of another division in ethical thought, another kind of clustering. In Fairness, Hierarchy, and Moral Rationalization, an essay, I refer to this as the division between morality and justice. What underlies the difference, I believe, is a fundamental duality in our experience of and thought about the world. The duality between a first-person stance and a third-person stance, roughly experiential and actuarial, respectively. In this case, a first-person and a third-person stance toward ethics, yielding concerns of morality and justice, respectively. I do not wish to discuss this division here, which is orthogonal to the socially gendered duality that is my primary concern in this essay. I simply wish to note a rather obvious point, that at least prima facie, the sciences systematize our knowledge about the third-person stance in ethics. Our understanding of the first-person stance in contrast, and thereby our comprehension of ethics as a whole, seem likely to be deepened by the complementary study of other types of attention to ethics, prominently those developed in literature and other arts. Of course, the arts are no more infallible or complete than the sciences, but they often recall us to the experiential part of a topic, thus the first-person perspective that is of particular importance in ethics, at least to the degree that this is bound up with empathy. It does not seem unreasonable, then, to turn to literature when seeking to resolve the quandaries raised in the preceding section. A particularly apt case to consider is Rabindranath Tagore's short story, Housewife. As I have discussed in Sexual Identities, the story concerns a teacher of young boys, Shivnath, When the boys do not act in a way that he finds appropriate, Srinagar tries to shame them into conformity. One of the most effective weapons in his armory is name-calling, attributing shameful characteristics to one of the boys, characteristics summarized in a nickname, and provoking the rest of the class to laugh derisively and taunt his victim. Tagore explains that one of the boys, named Ashu, has a younger sister. As there are no girls of her age in the neighborhood, this sister has no regular playmate. One rainy day, the sister wishes to enact the marriage ceremony of two of her dolls. Ashu agrees. Tagore clearly suggests that Ashu acted out of spontaneous empathy with his sister, presumably intensified by a feeling of attachment bonding that gave his empathic response greater force and greater specificity. I say greater specificity because, unlike many emotions, attachment bonding is oriented not toward classes of targets, but toward individuals. By an unfortunate coincidence, Srinagar happens to come upon Ashu and his sister, and he sees what they are doing. The following school day, Srinagar tells the other boys that Ashu spent his day off, engaged not in masculine activities, perhaps pulling the wings off insects or kicking small dogs, but playing at dolls with his little sister. When Ashu arrives at school, he is greeted with the derisive laughter of the class and their chanting of his new nickname, Housewife. Tagore concludes the story with the following sentence. You realize that to play with your little sister on a school holiday was the most shameful thing in the world, and he could not believe that people would ever forget what he had done. Though perhaps it is obvious to everyone, the point here is worth spelling out. This incident serves to create or reinforce a close association in Ashu's mind between shame on the one hand and femininity, empathy, and attachment on the other. The last three, femininity, empathy, and attachment, were probably already associated with one another for Ashu. And if this marked their first association with shame in his mind, it was undoubtedly not the last. In addition, research has demonstrated that shame is a volatile emotion. It may manifest itself in a desire to withdraw and hide, but it may lead instead to rage, the usual outcome of which is aggression. Thus, the incident first inhibits Ashu's feminine inclinations toward empathy and attachment care. In this way, the story hints that empathy and attachment care may arise no less spontaneously in males than in females, at least in childhood. In keeping with this, Fine reports research showing that parents, quote, frequently saw masculinity as something they needed to work on to accomplish, unlike femininity. Moreover, criticisms of gender-inappropriate play are, quote, especially reserved for boys. Dr. Keltner cites empirical studies that provide more positive support for the view suggested by Tagore. Specifically, quote, recent research finds that both parents show elevated levels of oxytocin, that neuropeptide that promotes boundary-dissolving openness and connection, 6 months after the birth of their first child, end quote. Of course, Ashu is not the father, but a sibling. Recalling my own reaction to the appearance of a considerably younger sibling and observing the attachment bonds in my wife's family, where older siblings often had parental roles, I find it intuitively plausible that a new baby could have similar oxytocin-elevating effects on older brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, I have not found any research testing this possibility. In any event, the sort of spontaneous inclination toward empathy and attachment care must be stifled in boys if they are going to successfully take up their roles as guardians of violence in the service of social hierarchy. One important social technique for this stifling is the induction of shame and its frequent concomitant of rage. Through the increased likelihood of rage, shame, as in the Housewife incident, may also foster the confrontational behavior and anger-based pugnacity that are so often prized in men. This goes at least some way toward explaining the gendering of virtues, which appeared to be something of a puzzle in the preceding section. It also suggests one reason why there might be such a thing as toxic masculinity. Next section is virtue and attachment care. Epigraph from Laleshwari. Like water in cups of unbaked clay, I run to waste. Would to God I were to reach my home, unquote. As indicated in the preceding section, I believe that Tagore is making an ethical point in Housewife. I take that point to be bound up with attachment care, but I do not in the least believe that his ethical ideals would confine one's ethical duties or one's ethically relevant emotions to kin. Assuming this is correct, I agree with Tagore, that is. Moreover, I reject the view shared by some ethicists of care and perhaps by some writers on the evolution of ethics, that our ethical responses both are and should be guided by personal relations, and thus are and should be preferential rather than universally egalitarian. For instance, writing from the perspective of an ethics of care, Held chastises Kantians and utilitarians for making, quote, no room at the foundational level for the partiality that connects us to those we care for and to those who care for us. She goes on to indicate that, quote, group identity, unquote, should have an important place in ethics. Since my ethical views are founded upon effortful empathy, as discussed in Literature and Moral Feeling, I share some central ethical presuppositions with ethicists of care. However, in my view, the motivational force of empathy should be modulated by a systematic consideration of ethical principles, which are necessarily universal, since the whole point of ethics is to work against the biases that go along with partiality. The valorization of group identity is precisely what we find in religious communalism, racism, ethnocentrism, and indeed patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny, despite the feminist views that writers often claim to be central to the ethics of care. In contrast with an ethics that favors in-group or affiliative relations, the logical conclusion of ethically extending attachment care would appear to be some sort of universalization of care, perhaps of the sort advocated in Mahayana Buddhism, which expands to include all sentient beings. Alternatively, it would perhaps lead to the more restricted but still pan-human ethics implied in Christianity and other religions that have articulated some version of the Golden Rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In a passage that calls to mind the gendering of our two ethical aggregates, as well as their relation to story genres, Kitcher explains that, quote, to forgive your enemies was a Judeo-Christian subversion of an older, so-called heroic morality. But the idea is already present in Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts. So, of course, is the lex talionis, unquote. Here again, it is useful to return to affective science. The sort of universalized care that Tagore hints at seems related to the emotions treated by Decker-Keltner under the label awe. Keltner writes that the feeling of awe works against the predominance of what he calls the default self. He explains that, quote, this self, one of many that makes up who you are, is focused on how you are distinct from others, independent, in control, and oriented toward competitive advantage, unquote. Keltner cites empirical research showing, he tells us, that in awe, quote, our default self vanishes, and we are shifted out of, quote, a competitive dog-eat-dog mindset, unquote. What replaces the default self, Keltner maintains, is, quote, caring and sharing in the sense of common humanity, unquote. He goes on to identify a paradigmatic case of such caring and sharing in the young child's relation to caregivers. This, to some degree, grounds awe in the transformed self in the attachment care system, though Keltner does not phrase the point this way. The connection is supported by Keltner's citation of empirical studies showing the importance of oxytocin levels in experiences of awe. Oxytocin is the hormone most directly linked with attachment care. In the preceding comments, I imagine that the roles of natural, spontaneous empathy, shame, which serves to modulate such empathy, and rage, which may substitute aggression for empathy, are all clear enough. But what about attachment care? Care is obviously germane to Ashu's case, for he has presumably formed an attachment bond with his sister. I have been treating care as if its operation is entirely straightforward, with attachment care simply enhancing empathic effort. But that is wrong. Again, attachment care is regularly signaled in the brain by the presence of the hormone oxytocin. In popular media and even some academic work, this has led to excessive enthusiasm for oxytocin, thus for attachment care, as a sort of neuroethical panacea for social conflict. However, as Sapolsky explains, quote, oxytocin makes you more pro-social to people like you, thus in-group members, but spontaneously lousy to others from out-groups. This is not a problem for some ethicists of care, such as Held, but it is a problem for me, because again, and I believe Tagore, are advocating a universalist ethics, thus one that does not treat in-group members preferentially. At the same time, and it seems Tagore, view the attachment system as in some way underwriting this universalism. Perhaps the problem can be resolved by distinguishing different subcomponents or processes within the attachment system, rather like the reward system, which includes both a seeking or wanting component mediated by dopamine and a culminative pleasure or liking component mediated by endogenous opioids. It seems that it should be possible to distinguish between, say, entrenched attachments and attachments that arise contextually when one's attachment care system is activated in relation to a target with whom one does not have an ongoing relationship, and even in situations where no shared identity category is salient. At least in some cases, it seems plausible that such an activation could promote an attachment care-related intensification of compassion through activation of the care system. This may occur due, for example, to one's perhaps innate responsiveness to certain sensory configurations, such as facial proportions of small children. Something of the sort may be what happens when even some committed racists feel spontaneous concern for or attraction toward infants of other races. Other sources of such attachment activation would include a range of sensitivities formed during the critical period in the development of one's own attachment system, including subtle features of speech or action that inspire implicit trust, as well as the activation of emotional memories related to an earlier attachment object. We may refer to the products of such processes as identity discrepant and non-affiliative attachment feelings. The epigraph from Laleshwari for Aus dem Nichts. Oneness has turned me into nothingness. Fatih Akin's 2017 film begins with Nuri walking through a prison, surrounded by applauding inmates with whom he shares enthusiastic hand clasps and roughhouse shadowboxing, as if this were a testosterone-driven prelude or conclusion to a sporting event. But when the doors open at the end of the corridor, we see that Nuri's bride, Katya, is waiting to marry him. The shaky handheld camera is clearly intended to remind the viewer of the home videos that people made of their weddings before it became common to have the ceremony recorded professionally. The very long and intense embrace of the couple upon first meeting leads us to understand implicitly that they have been separated for a long time. The video cuts from the embrace to the moment when the couple takes their vows. After the vows, Nuri asks, somewhat shyly, if he may now kiss the bride. The entire scene of the wedding is designed to remind the viewer of similar moments in his or her own life. Perhaps one's wedding, or being reunited with someone one loves after a long separation. In other words, they are attachment memories. But these memories are activated without drawing attentional focus. The most important of these stored fragments of past experience are so-called emotional memories, which activate their associated emotions. In this case, attachment. Though, of course, he did not have the vocabulary of cognitive and affective science to draw on, this is almost exactly what the 10th century Kashmiri philosopher Abhinavagupta saw as occurring in literary response and as enabling the generalization of personal emotions, their extension from the narrow circle of ourselves and those we know and care about to others, first of all, to characters in the literary work. In our terms, the experience of the emotion without attentional focus on the representational content of the episodic memories. For example, without attentional focus on recollections of things that happened at one's own wedding, may be the mechanism whereby we come to feel attachment-intensified care without the usual identity divisions and outgrouping. The scene ends with a cut to an intertitle giving us the theme of part 1, the family. This is followed by a cut, to a young boy, Rocco, roughly 4 or 5 years old. The actor has been chosen to look part Turkish and part German, but his curly hair could also be viewed as feminine, despite his manly-sounding name. Rocco's role in combining traits of socially opposed identity groups seems clear. In addition, his glasses make him appear vulnerable, but he stares confidently into the camera. The camera lingers on the boy's face, then pans to his hand held by Katya. The entire shot seems designed to stir attachment memories, while keeping the viewer's attention on the mother and child, not on the representations associated with one's own parents or children, as represented in episodic memories. When he is almost run over by a car, Rocco curses the driver. Katya asks him if he picked up that from his father, perhaps suggesting to the viewer that such behavior is characteristic of men or of Turks. But she, female and German, cursed the driver too. In case the viewer might jump to the conclusion that this should be attributed to the class or educational background of the parents, Rocco explains that he had acquired this new vocabulary during his violin lessons. When Katya and Rocco meet Nuri, Nuri asks why Katya needs to borrow the car. Can't she and Birgit take the train, he asks. Birgit is a close friend of Katya's, whom we have not yet seen. Rocco immediately explains that Aunt Birgit is pregnant, then chides his father for lacking, quote, empathy. He stresses each syllable as if teaching a wayward child. Nuri warmly approves of his son's advanced moral sensibility. For our purposes, the insistence on empathy is obviously crucial, but so is the film's stress on the non-difference between the male and female characters. Akin Akin begins to suggest this in the wedding scene when he dresses both the bride and groom in white and makes Nuri apparently more shy in his responses than Katya. In this scene, we see it again when the boy is the one who stresses empathy. We find it in the cursing, too, along with Katya's false idea that such cursing is specifically male. This gender non-difference is extended in the following scene when Katya and Birgit engage in a somewhat raucous sex talk that we might be inclined to attribute to testosterone if they were male. As Katya is driving to pick up Nuri and Rocco, she encounters a roadblock. A bomb has exploded, killing a man and a boy. Subsequently, we learn that the victims were Nuri and Rocco. The police investigation and trial follow with considerable attention to the mother's terrible grief. Her memories are suggested by shots of the boy's bed and in effect shared directly with the viewer when Katya replays videos of the three of them together. Combined with the earlier activation of attachment memories, this is designed to facilitate and indeed intensify our empathy with the mother. The empathy is initially with her grief, then for some viewers, her desire for revenge. The desire for revenge begins early on. At one point, Katya complains of herself that had she been killed instead of Nuri, Nuri would have taken more decisive action. She seems to make this claim based primarily on gender and perhaps ethnic stereotypes, as she has already made an ill-considered attempt to assault one of the defendants in the courtroom. Indeed, her belief here recalls her earlier conjecture that Rocco learned to curse from Nuri. In the end, she enacts revenge on the exonerated defendants. Part of the reason for this is probably that she believes Nuri would have undertaken such decisive action. But again, the film appears to suggest that this is merely a gender and ethnic stereotype. After all, neither Nuri's father nor his lawyer and family friend seems to consider revenge at all male in Turkish. The defendants are a man and woman. We know that they are Nazis, and we are confident that they committed the crime. Note that the even balance of the sexes indicates again that at least as far as the film is concerned, violence is not a simple product of anatomical sex. Despite the viewer's confidence, however, I would say that we should not have absolute certainty about their guilt. This is important as it bears on our response to their exoneration and on Katya's decision to murder them in revenge. The film here is implicitly dealing with a serious problem in the way that ethical reflection is commonly developed. It often involves stipulated certainty, as in, suppose you know that the only way to stop a trolley is to push a man in front of you onto the tracks, and so on. But in real life, we never have such certainty. Similarly, in films, we may actually have seen the defendant committing the act, but that happens only rarely. For example, when we have security camera footage of an unmasked criminal. The film does a reasonably good job of making it about as clear as possible that the defendants in the case are the guilty parties. In this sense, the court's reasonable doubt does not appear to be reasonable. Exonerating the two on the basis of reasonable doubt does not appear reasonable. But even conviction beyond a reasonable doubt is not the same as absolute certainty. This means, perhaps, that Katya has about as good a reason to take revenge as is possible in real life. Katya ultimately enacts revenge, detonating a bomb that kills the accused couple, as well as Katya herself. Ethically considered, I find it almost impossible to see an argument in favor of this revenge. As someone opposed to the death penalty, I hardly consider vigilante murder ethical. From a Kantian perspective, it lacks justification in not being universalizable, and in not treating anyone, including Katya herself, as an end, but only as a mere means. In consequentialist terms, we know that Katya has been recognized and can be almost certain that she will be identified as the murderer of the couple, fostering sympathy for them. This is likely to fail as completely as her attempt to assault the woman in the courtroom and to have far worse consequences. As to the care perspective, as is probably clear, I do not take this to provide a decision procedure for acting ethically. Rather, in my formulation, it encourages us to broaden our empathic efforts and ethical concerns to encompass not only heroic, but also, indeed primarily, familial roles and dilemmas. Personally, I would like to have seen Katya pursue the legal case while engaging in programs that might erode some of the hostility that made Rocco and Nuri innocent victims of violence, rather than engaging in retributive violence herself. I believe it is a mistake to valorize identity and affiliation, as some ethicists of care do, which were probably part of the problem to begin with. Nazis are, after all, advocates of precisely apolitics and arguably for them, a sort of ethics based on identity categories. On the other hand, I do not believe that any of this is the primary ethical or political purpose of the film. I take it that Akin would encourage us to empathize with Katya, as we should, but not with the two likely murderers. Rather, I suspect that Akin's main thematic point is that suicide bombers do not come out of nowhere, to advert to the title of the film. They come out of a history of traumatic violence, grief, and injustice. Therefore, in the same circumstances, someone of any national or religious origin would do the same thing. This is an important point, but one orthogonal to the morality or immorality of the act itself. What is more directly related to our concerns, however, is that the film can be read as suggesting, however slightly, that Katya has pursued suicide revenge due to misguided gender stereotypes manifest in her comments about Nuri and cursing, then about Nuri and revenge. She is in effect imitating her stereotypical ideas about Nuri. In a way, the problem with her error is that she has failed to take to heart the final words of her son when he adjured his father to have greater empathy, as he pronounces it. However, different viewers are likely to have very different responses to the film and to find it hard to reach a consensus, in part because they are likely to favor different standard employments of ethics and of the film itself. And maybe you can hear from some of you who have seen the film in the discussion afterwards. I began this essay by reference to the empirically established correlation between sex ratios in a society and the level of violence in the society. I have been treating this correlation as if it derives from the different virtues associated with men and women, particularly the virtues that bear on violence. But that could put the causality backwards. Indeed, one imagines that a society that is more hospitable to women and girls, more careful about their health and well-being, would be a less violent society generally. In that case, we wouldn't say that the society is less violent because it has more women, but that it has more women because it is less violent. This interpretation would be consistent with my general skepticism about claims of gender difference, finding them most often to be false or exaggerated, and thereby functional in sexist ideology, or to result from situational differences as well as more enduring socialization, and thereby functional in patriarchal social structure. On the other hand, the correlation fits common socially defined norms for male and female virtue so well that it seems unlikely that such norms play no role in the proliferation or limitation of social violence. Moreover, At least some of the putatively masculine virtues, righteous anger, physical bravery, and a general disposition toward preventive or punitive violence, appear to cluster together. This is also the case for some of the putatively feminine virtues, empathy or compassion, supportive generosity, and generally a disposition toward cooperative compromise and conciliation. This sort of aggregation is just what one would expect from the employment of ethics via recurring story genres treated in my earlier work. However, that employment concerned the way in which we think about moral problems, not the virtues we have, or might wish, to cultivate in ourselves and others. Through reflections on two literary narratives, I have sought to situate these virtues in the context of a social cultivation of emotions or motivational systems, particularly empathy, itself modulated by the stifling effect of shame and the facilitative effect of attachment care. The most important form of the last is a sort of attachment system activation that does not carry in its train identity group definition and associated antagonisms or affiliative preferences. In connection with this, I have reiterated my earlier suggestion that Rabindranath Tagore's account of the activation of what we now call emotional memories provides the outline of a potentially highly illuminating account of literary response, including ethical response to literature. These memories, probably in connection with emotion triggers of other sorts, for example, innate sensitivities, are not fixed to their initial targets, but give a sort of emotional coloring to the target of our current attention. This emotional coloring from attachment memories should, in turn, foster effortful empathy. Thank you. There's the works cited. And now let's see if I can figure out how to turn this off.